Slapping gums at each other. Any chance they get. The fight clock is brought to you by Modelo.
It's time
for you to sit back, relax, and listen to a complete and fucking utter armchair expert give his completely and utterly useless opinions on the one hell of an amazing sport that is MMA.
300% growth. We've somehow made it to episode 3. Giving myself a pat on the back, yo. Yep. Somehow made it to episode 3. Don't know how. I really don't. But we did it. Celebrating that shit. Yeah. Well, you may ask. Well, yeah, first of all, this is obviously... Wait, did I say it was episode 3? No, it's episode 4. 300% growth because we're 3 episodes up on what we were. Okay, episode 4 of MMA Quick Chat. You may ask, why am I recording an episode when there's no UFC events for about 2 weeks? Well, the reason I'm recording is because I want to recap on our first episode where I talked about, who I was, how I got into MMA, my favourite fighters, etc. I wanted to recap that because I've got a better mic now. And also, I wanted to talk about some of the MMA news and rumours that are going on at the moment. And I figured an episode of MMA Quick Chat was the only place to do that. So, when we come back after this short breather and break, that is exactly what I'm going to do. So, essentially what we're doing here is we are recapping our first episode, where we talked about, who I am, how I got into fighting, some interesting stories, etc. So, well, yeah, we're doing it because, I have a better mic now and it would sound better. So, let's get into it. So, as I said in the last one, my name's Aidan Thomas. I'm 22 years old from the western suburbs of Melbourne in Australia. And essentially how I got into fighting was my first... I got into fighting and UFC mainly because of my dad. My dad had a job at the time where he was servicing 2 particular customers from about, I'd say, 2010 to 2012. Who were really big into UFC at the time. And that's how he started getting into it. And before I knew it, UFC was all the rage. And I was going to watch it all the time and blah, blah, blah. But my first ever real exposure that I can remember to UFC was when my dad gave me a UFC Ultimate Knockouts DVD, which I think was one of his customers, incidentally, to watch. And I watched that, and that was my first ever exposure to MMA. But the first... I may have watched a handful of fights, that I probably don't remember now. But the first fight, the first time I can distinctively remember going to watch fights was... I think the first time might have been at the Tarmac Hotel in Leverton. Yeah, the Tarmac Hotel in Leverton, which is obviously about maybe 15 minutes from my house. But where we would ultimately settle on, me, my dad, because that's who I was watching it with, by the way. I forgot to mention me, my dad, and his mate. But where we would ultimately settle was a place called the West End Hotel in Sunshine, which is also in the west of Melbourne, probably about half an hour from my house. So we went there regularly, watched all sorts of UFC fights, watched DC versus Jones 2, watched Stipe versus DC, and Brock Lesnar into the octagon, and we all hoped he was going to come back. And I was going to watch Khabib versus Conor there, but I didn't, and I'm spewing I didn't, because I would have loved to have watched that brawl live. That would have been sick. But I'll tell an interesting story, actually, before I get into the interesting fighters, because I'm re-recording this, so unfortunately fucked up the first one, so if I'm being a little bit brash, it's because I'm re-recording this. Essentially, the one other fight I went to the West End to watch was MMA. Everyone knows what that is. Mayweather vs McGregor, 2017. And me, my dad, and his mate, and pretty much everyone else was somewhere watching that. Well, there were certainly a lot of people at the West End. I know that because I look back at the start of the fight and no one was in the room, and then mid-fight I look back and the whole room was full that I was in. People standing up, sitting down, blah blah blah. So yeah, that's just what Conor does. He brings the people out. But those who listen will know of my mate Jesse. I've mentioned him in this podcast before. He was the one who gave this podcast its name because I didn't have a name for it. He's like, how about MMA Quick Chat? Because you're having a quick chat about MMA. So that's how this ever so interesting podcast got its name. But essentially we met in high school, were friends up until about early 2017, stopped being friends and came back in 2019, and you know, what happened. But in 2017 when that fight happened, we weren't friends, I was obviously watching Maymac at the West End Hotel in Sunshine, and he was also watching the same fight with his dad at a sports club in Sunshine. So it's funny, we were watching the same fight in the same area on the same day, and we didn't even know until later. But yeah, to cut a long story short, me and Jesse are obviously friends again now. We're big into MMA. For a while I wasn't. I don't know, it just wasn't on my radar for some reason. You know, we would do other things, but in about, well, what made us get into MMA was I'd seen on his story that he had seen Masvidal versus Nate Diaz, the fight for the BMF title, the one where Nate got cut and it got stopped by the doctor. I saw that he'd seen that, and that was like, oh, you're into UFC? Shit, I am too. Maybe we should go watch it. And so the first UFC fight me and him ever saw was in early 2020, Conor vs Cowboy, at the pub local to both of us. And yeah, that was our first UFC fight, and we've been watching pretty much ever since for the last 2 years. We're big into it now. We get the posters, you know, we get all the other stuff. We really want to go. We're really salty that we didn't get to go last time they were in Melbourne, and we really want to go whenever they come back. But yeah, essentially that's who I am, why I got into MMA, and where I'm at now. And when I come back, we'll get into my favourite fighters of all time and why. I've got a list. I went back to the other podcast and got a list of them all. And then we'll talk about some of the news and rumours going on at the moment. Oh, because, yeah, in case I didn't mention, that's another reason why I'm recording this episode. But, yeah, all that and more when I return. Okay, my favourite fighters of all time and today. I've made a list of the ones from the other podcast, and I'll go through them with a brief history as to why, because I don't need to go into too much detail. We already did that the first one, even though it would be better to hear it in this one. And I've added some names to the list as well, actually. So anyway, here we go for the second time. Brock Lesnar came into MMA in, I think, 2007. Demolished a guy who had been at the same Olympics as Kurt Angle had, which, if you know Brock's history, you'll know how he knows Kurt Angle. Came in, dominated him, got into the UFC in 2008, lost to Frank Mir in under a minute 30, I think, to a heel hook. Then he beat Heath Herring convincingly, broke his orbital bone after Heath had been talking smack, as it turns out, going past his locker. He then beat Randy Couture for the belt in his fourth MMA fight, as the 43-year-old returning Randy Couture, I should add, who as good a wrestler as he was in his own right, he was no match for Brock. Brock was just too big, too fast, too explosive. His first offence was obviously probably the biggest card prior to Conor, UFC 100. I got the poster of it on my wall. Him and Frank Mir again for the second time, and this time he battered Frank Mir, and of course we know what happened afterwards. The horseshoe up your ass promo, infamous, was made to apologise for it because he talked about, I think, the opposing beer to the one that was sponsoring the UFC or something, and of course Dana wasn't happy, as we know he can get. But he then went on to have his second offence, and probably one of mine and my dad's favourite fights, against Shane Cohen. Thought he was going to get beat in round one. Shane nearly beat him, but then of course it went on to round two, and as we know, Shane was only really good for one round and got beat by a submission. And then of course UFC 121, the fight that he had the yellow skin because he'd had diverticulitis after he fought Shane. He came back with the thick beard and the yellow skin, didn't really look well, and of course got beat soundly by Cain Velasquez, who pretty much left a cut on his face, which he's still got a scar as a result of today. Yeah, it was a fight a lot of people remember. Then of course got beat by Alistair Overeem, who was just coming into the UFC. He knew what to target, got beaten, went back to the WWE in I think 2012 for about 5 years until 2016 when he came back at UFC 200 and fought Mark Hunt, and he hasn't fought since. He obviously, as I mentioned prior, came back to the UFC fold when DC fought Stipe, and a lot of people thought he was going to fight DC, including me. I was sort of low-key hoping that would happen, but it didn't. And yeah, now he's in the WWE. Look, to come in to have come in at 30 and fought some really top-class fighters and managed to do what he did, win the belt, blah, blah, blah. You got to give him credit for that. I do think, had he have skipped pro wrestling and just gone straight into MMA after college, because he was obviously a collegiate wrestler, and a collegiate wrestling champion, actually. But had he have gone into MMA straight after college, I think he could have absolutely been one of the GOATs in the heavyweight division. Don't get me wrong, that's not downplaying what he did. Obviously former UFC heavyweight champion, probably a Hall of Famer one day. I'd like to see him go into the Hall of Fame. That'd be nice. But I think had he have actually come in and got a good grounding and maybe fought in Pride first in Japan, because obviously he had connections there through different people. But had he have gone to maybe Pride first or Strikeforce or something, and then went to UFC, I think he could have absolutely been one of the GOATs. No doubt about it. Next up, we got Conor McGregor. We all know, double champ. Shut the fuck up. Who the fuck is that guy? The champ. Double champ does whatever the fuck he wants. Took the UFC by storm, and even though his legacy probably isn't what it once was because of the fall from grace and the losses that he's had, I will never not give him credit for what he's done for this sport. And of course, the crossover, blah, blah, blah. He's just... hate him or love him, when he fights, people tune in, and, he will always be one of my favourite fighters of all time. Definitely a UFC Hall of Famer at some point. That's not even a question, I don't think. He definitely should be. Alistair Overeem came in against Brock, of course. Very unlucky to not get the belt. He got close to it, but didn't, of course. And then, of course, the way his career went, I think a lot of people knew it was at the end rather than the start, sadly. But great fighter. Been fighting since '99, I think, in Pride, in Dream, and then of course Strikeforce, and then of course the UFC, and now Glory Kickboxing have picked him up, where he's going to be having a fight. But yeah, great fighter, nice guy. Was really unlucky to not pick the belt up, but MMA can be a cruel world sometimes. Cain Velasquez. It's a shame his career went the way it did, as a result of, losing the belt, the whole Mexico thing, injuries, etc. But he was probably one of the greats of the heavyweight division back then, and could easily have been a GOAT had things gone his way. DC, Daniel Cormier. 2-division champ, great wrestler. Will forever, I think, be remembered for the Jones and Stipe rivalries. Yeah, he's just... And an even greater guy, too. He's one of my favourites. Khabib, 29-0, undefeated, never lost a round. Of course, I think will always forever be more remembered for the Conor fight than anything else. The aftermath of it. Sorry, my mic nearly fell over. I think a lot of people were sad by the way he retired. But, he went out on his own terms, kept the belt. You can't... as sad as it was that it wasn't in front of people, that would have been nice. You can't get a much better ending than that, so you got to give the guy props for that. Next up's Anderson. Didn't sadly see much of him. I've obviously seen later, the Chael Sonnen rivalry, blah blah blah. But of course, after those whole events in Abu Dhabi, it sort of went a bit south, and I wish I'd seen him fight in Melbourne against Izzy. It's a sore spot for me. But, yeah, he's probably one of the greats of the sport, and probably sadly not remembered as much as he should be, especially by casuals. And finally, we've got GSP. Legend of the sport prior to the whole Johnny Hendricks scenario, and then didn't fight for 4 years. Came back against Bisping, took the belt from him, and then didn't defend it. So, probably not as fondly looked at as in the UFC, or in the UFC's eyes as much as he is by fans, but definitely a legend and a go to the sport. Now, as for the fighters I like to watch today, we've got Izzy, of course, Israel Adesanya. Wasn't a big fan of him probably until the Costa fight, when he did the whole Raw Dog thing and embarrassed him, and then of course pretty much a lot of the fights I've watched since have had him in them. You got the... I don't think he should have ever gone up to light heavyweight against Jan Blachowicz, because the way he and the UFC approached that were just wrong. He never bulked up, But the UFC, I think a lot was really riding on him to become a 2-division champ at that point. He'd been put on the cover of UFC 4. The UFC really wanted him to win, and you could see why. They probably almost, I'd say, saw the next coming of Conor, possibly in Izzy, and to make that guy a 2-division champ, would be, I imagine, very good for the UFC. So he had a lot riding on him, but it didn't quite work out. And then, of course, you got Vettori, and now, of course, Whittaker back in February, which I sadly only saw the second fight of. Didn't see the first one in Melbourne, which is still a sore spot. But yeah, me and Jesse are a big fan of his, and do enjoy watching his fights and seeing him win. The next, of course, is Peter Yan. Now, I said in the last episode that he would easily take his belt back from Aljamain Sterling after the controversial finish of their last fight in March last year on the I said in the first episode that, sorry, not the last episode, but I talked about the controversial finish in their last fight in March last year on the same card as Izzy versus Jan. Well, that of course didn't happen. He went into it way too angry, in my opinion. Aljo took advantage of that, and he didn't take his belt back. But they reckon he might fight TJ for another chance at it. I reckon he might get that because he's easily one of the, he's one of the, what do you call it, the best boxers. Got one of the quickest sets of hands I've seen in the UFC. And yeah, he's a great fighter. Next up's Dustin Poirier. Another one who's been unlucky with the belt, and not getting it. Great fighter, great guy. Of course, beat Conor twice. Got a great payday in the process. He's someone I'd like to meet. Honestly, I feel like he'd be a great guy to chat with. Next up's Oliveira. I feel like he'll be dominant for a long time. I knew as soon as I saw video footage on his wrestling that he'd beat Dustin, and he did. Although I must say, Dustin did defend his takedowns a lot better than I thought he would. I thought he'd just get ragdolled, but he must have trained, which is good for him. But yeah, Oliveira I think will be dominant for a long time. I don't see anyone, Gaethje included, beating him. And I'm going to be watching that fight next month, except for maybe Islam, but even then, I feel like Charlie Olives will be dominant for a long time. Next up's Michael Chandler. Now, I was pissed off when he got the shot at the belt after one fight against Charles, because obviously Khabib left and, Dustin wanted his third shot at Conor, which, in hindsight, I can't blame him for, even though maybe that fight shouldn't have happened. But I do have to say he, one, was successful in Bellator, so you can see why the UFC would want to push him. And two, he puts on great fights. I mean, just look at that fight versus Gaethje. That was a banger. Could have easily, been fight of the year. That was one of my favourite fights to watch, and he is one of my favourite fighters to watch. I'm glad that they're all, including the next guy, Justin Gaethje, is going to be on the card I'm watching next month. And Gaethje, another unlucky guy at the title. Another guy who's been unlucky in his shots at the title. Great fighter though, and great guy by the sounds of it. Always likes to, make his face seen and show up to support the fighters in the UFC events that I see. So, I do like to see that. But yeah, great guy, great fighter. Be glad to see him all next month. Next up, we've got Usman. I, of course, watched him beat Colby. Obviously a dominant champ. There's rumours going around at the moment that he might fight Conor, which of course we'll speak on. But yeah, good fighter. Dominant champ, etc. Next up, I've got Nunes. Dominant up until the Pena loss, which shocked me and the entire MMA world, I think. But I believe she'll get back up there because, she's just a kick-ass fighter, as you can tell. And finally, and this is one I do want to talk about a bit, we've got Weili. Great fighter. Single-handedly saved UFC 248 from that unfortunate abomination that was Yoel versus Izzy in that fight of the year performance, which I sadly didn't see, and I'm so annoyed that I didn't. But yeah, what a fighter she is, man. Was unlucky to lose her belt to Thug Rose, but she'll get back up there, man. I need to watch that fight from UFC 248 on Fight Pass, which I'm going to be getting soon. But yeah, they're pretty much my favourite fighters of all time and today. Just a recap on that now that we've got a better mic. It'll be easier for you guys to hear, of course. Again, apologies if I've been snappy or trying to be quick through this, but as I said, I I've had to re-record this because I sadly stuffed up the other one. So, yeah, it's a little bit annoying. But anyway, this is obviously a recap of episode 1. And, yeah. Good to go back over old things now that you'll be able to understand them better. But, yeah. Gee whiz, 25 minutes. This must be easily our longest podcast by the time we add in the last bit, which we'll be coming back to, in that we'll be talking about a few MMA rumours going around at the moment. So, yeah, all that when I return. So, of course, as always in the MMA world, there's a few rumours going around. And I figured I'd use the last a few minutes of this podcast to discuss them. Now, the first one I heard a couple of days ago is that Jon Jones is looking to come back. Now, we've heard this multiple times through the years. He apparently wants McGregor money to come back, but now it's looking like it could, according to rumour, possibly be happening, because he is apparently in training camp looking to fight Stipe Miocic in the summer. And I tell you, if that happens, me and my mate will be watching, because I haven't seen a Jon Jones fight in I don't even remember how long. I think he's been gone for 2 years. It's probably been longer since I've seen a Jon Jones fight. And be interesting to see him at, 260 or whatever he's supposed to be at now. Yeah, be interesting to actually see him fight at heavyweight. But I will, yeah, if that fight actually does come to fruition, which we don't know until the contract's signed, I will definitely be watching it with my mate. And the other one I've heard over the last couple of days is Conor coming back. Now, there's been a number of names thrown up, Poirier 4, Diaz, Cejudo, blah, blah, blah. But the biggest one, I think, and this is the one that I think won't happen, is Usman. Conor and Usman, and Conor has mentioned this himself for the title. Obviously, Usman will beat him. There's no doubt about that. It'll be an easy payday for Conor. Easy payday for Usman, rather. But there's 2 fights in that whole collection that I really don't, to be honest, want to see happen. One of them, of course, is him versus Poirier 4. Number one, what other fighter has ever got 3 chances, to try and beat someone in the UFC ever, even though this is Conor? And 2, it's clear that Dustin is head and shoulders above Conor ability-wise right now. So, yeah, I really hope that fight doesn't happen. And the other one, I really hope, and a lot of people I'm sure would disagree with me, it doesn't happen, is him versus Nate again. Because it simply wouldn't live up to what it was 5 years ago at UFC 202. They're both very different for very different reasons. Conor obviously went and boxed and got a load of money doing it. And Nate, Nate's at the end of his career, whether we want to admit it or not. He himself has said he wants to retire. How genuine it is, who knows? But yeah, he can't fight for too much longer without getting permanently damaged, I don't think. Because it's obvious, fighting has taken a toll on both Diaz brothers, I think, which is sad. But yeah, anyway, that's episode 4, guys. I just realised I did say episode 3 in the intro, so no, it is episode 4, to be clear. Yeah, good to go back over old episodes, and make sure they're clear for you guys to hear now that I've got a clearer mic and some proper studio equipment. I'm going to be doing another podcast in about maybe a week or 2. It'll drop the Saturday before UFC 274 happens in Australia, or the Saturday of, if you're listening in America. But yeah, 29 minutes. Should I extend it out to be 30 minutes and just well, we've got about 30 seconds to go. But yeah. Oh, also, before I go, it will be 30 minutes. I want to ask you guys a question. would you guys be interested in me doing some occasional podcasts like this when there's no UFC events on, evaluating past cards? Would you guys be interested in that? Comment on the post that this podcast is about, and or send me an email or DM if you would. But anyway, that's going to be the end of this one, guys. It's been good to go back over old episodes and events again. But until UFC 274, which I will be watching and making a podcast evaluating, take it easy, guys.